Hello, BookTube. This is my Space Opera September wrap-up. Space Opera September is a BookTube reading event created by Thomas of SFF 180, in which participants read space opera in the month of September. To date, there have been 3 seasons, or not 3 seasons. It's on its 3rd year, but there have been 2 seasons. Season 1 repeated in 2020. There are a number of prompts and collaborative sort of challenges and stuff, so it can be a lot of fun. I must admit that my Space Opera September was a bit of a disaster, and let's get to it. So the first book I read for Space Opera September was Radiance by Catherynne and Valente. Radiance is a rather unique space opera. It is set in a solar system, our solar system, that is radically different than the one we know. All of the planets, all of the moons are habitable and are significantly closer together. So close that 19th century technology can quite comfortably start the exploration and colonization process of the moon and Venus and Mars. The novel is also unique in how it's structured, and I'll get to that in a bit. But first, a quick synopsis. So, Radiance is about loss and grief and coming to terms with it. In the 1940s, early 1940s, I think, or might have been early 30s, but anyway, in this setting, the documentary filmmaker Catherynne disappeared during the filming of what would come to be her last film. And her loss, her presumed death, has haunted so many people whose lives she touched. And in a way, this is a novel sort of exploring and coming to terms with that loss, and about who Catherynne was, and everything else. So the story is told in a number of texts. Film scripts, Catherynne's own films. The transcript of her lover's debrief by the film studio. Film script from one of her stepmother's films. A radio teleplay, I think that would be the appropriate term, from a long-running radio program. Also includes transcripts of home movies that her father, the famed filmmaker Percival Onk, made. Percival, think of him as this universe's version of Alfred Hitchcock. It also includes a diary from one of her stepmothers. The novelized workings of film ideas by Percival Onk and his scriptwriting partner Vincenzo Mako to sort of to grapple with and come to terms with the loss of his daughter, primarily by turning this young boy who is the sole survivor of the destruction of a Venusian village that formed the basis of Catherynne's last film, as a private detective hired to figure out what happened to her. Initially, the story changes drastically over time. It also includes some opinion pieces from Scandal magazine's commercials, so on and so forth. And it even involves or two actual scenes that aren't textual within the context of the story. I loved this book when I first read it, and when I reread it in 2019. This particular reading, though, I don't love it as much. Now, I've never quite liked the film treatments that Percival Onk and mate Vince worked on. Particularly the first batch, where Anchises, the young boy, now an adult, is a private detective. It's bad. It's bad. But on this reading, it's like so much else of the story doesn't really come together. It doesn't connect in a way that I think really brings the story together at the end. And I think when I first read the novel in 2017 and then in 2019, what appealed to me was the experimental nature of this. I mean, this is not your usual space opera. But on a third reading, I mean, so much of the story really doesn't come together. It just really doesn't connect or work. It's just a bunch of text that doesn't really lead anywhere at the end. And I'm frustrated. I mean, I love this book, and now I don't love it so much. It's rather frustrating. The next two books fulfilled the Rita duology prompt for season 2. I didn't participate in any of the collaborative events, so I just decided to read a duology. Well, at the moment it's a duology. It will likely be a trilogy in the near future, if not more. But anyway, so I reread A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine. This novel is about Mahit Zamer, who is newly appointed ambassador from Desolation to the Taix Kalani Empire after the Taix Kalani demand a new ambassador. Mahit's remit is to find out what happened to her predecessor and to protect Desolation from any territorial ambitions that the Taix Kalani may have. In fulfilling her assignments, Mahit gets involved in increasing political chaos within the Taix Kalani Empire that sees the present government threatened, as well as an increase in warmongering. And to complicate everything, there is a looming alien threat lurking in the background. I have struggled with this novel every time I've read it. I love the climax. The climax is amazing. But I don't like the rest of the book. And I'd hoped with this reading I would figure out, I would settle my opinions on this book. And I think I have. The climax works because while it is from Mahit's point of view, except for the interludes, the entire story is from Mahit's point of view. Mahit is not the main character in this section. It's not about her. She's an observer. And I think that's why the climax works so well for me, is that Mahit is just an observer. She's not as active a player. And I think ultimately I don't like the rest of the book because I just don't like Mahid as a character. I don't think she really fits in with the story. Um, she's too young to be an ambassador. It's. I don't think I mentioned this when I did my review for weekly reads or my weekly wrap up and preview of what I've read in the week past and the week ahead. But very much appointing her to the ambassadorship without any diplomatic training is basically akin to the scene in Babylon 5, where Londo and Jakar, the ambassadors to Babylon 5 from this. Jakar is the ambassador from Narn, and Londo is the ambassador from the Centauri. They're negotiating a border dispute, and Londo has something else he wants to do. I think. So he has something else he wants to do. So he basically tells his assistant Veer to negotiate in his place. Jakar takes umbrage at this, so he instructs his attaché, who I'm blanking on her name, to negotiate in his place. And both ambassadors, as a parting shot to their assistants, tell them, whatever you do, don't give up the homeworld. And yeah, and very much it's sort of in appointing of Mahit, who, while her love of Tax Kalani culture is impressive, I mean, which would give her some success as being an ambassador to such a literarily obsessed culture as the Tax Kalani, that someone so young, so inexperienced, you're practically begging her to give up Lissel Station because she's going to screw up. Realistically, it's now I understand there's a trend, and certainly in fantasy, because it's a similar thing that happens in the Trader Barry Cormorant, of younger of characters, usually protagonists, being too young for the roles they're assigned, possibly to appeal to an ideal audience or something. But it just, I don't care for Mahit as a character, and yeah, I don't really like the rest of the book except for the climax. So it should come as no surprise that deciding to read A Desolation Called Peace immediately after A Memory Called Empire, I ended up bailing on this. I couldn't do it. Now, A Desolation Called Peace follows up a few months after A Memory Called Empire, in which the conflict between the Taix Kalani and the mysterious alien species that haunted A Memory Called Empire is starting. And in order to communicate with this new species, whose language is so radically different than most other species, Three Seagrass, who was Mahit's attaché, minder, who's since risen in government to a vice ministerial position in her department, appoints herself as sort of to take over, to head the attempt to talk to these aliens. And for some reason, she decides to include Mahit as well, who's pretty much, for some reason, back home on Lissel Station. Yeah. It's like, as much as I love the climax of A Memory Called Empire, that ending, is okay. Um, so the one positive I can say about A Desolation Called Peace is that Mahit isn't the only point of view character. There are a number of points of view in this book that um, make the story like, but at the same time, Mahit's still there, and yeah, and I'm not really sure why she's there. Um, but anyway, so oh yeah, before I forget, there are a few interludes from the aliens' point of view, and yeah, less said about that, the better. So I got a few, about maybe 50 pages, maybe almost 100 in, and I'm like, I don't want to do this, so I bailed. And then I took a few weeks off from Space Opera September before I finished up the the fourth book that I set for my TBR. I was tempted to hold off on Dune until this month, so that I could participate in a read along. Mayberry Book Club, booktuber who doesn't usually read science fiction, was talked into reading Dune for his book club that he's running alongside Steve Donahue, who is a great fan of science fiction and fantasy. That they would read Dune in October, since the Denis Villeneuve version is coming out later this month. From what I've heard, the less said about that movie, the better. Anyway, so I was kind of waffled between wanting to go ahead and finish off Dune in September or participating in the read along. I decided to just go ahead and finish off Dune, so that way I'd be finished and I could participate in the read along, which is usually what I do. I like to read a book in like one at a time. I don't like to like read a book for a bit, put it down for some time, and then come back to it. So I had another go at Dune. Dune is a story which really this book doesn't need much of an introduction or plot synopsis, but I'll give it to you anyway because I did it for the other three. Dune is about Paul Atreides, the son of Duke Leto Atreides, the hereditary governor Duke of the planet Caladan, until he is forced by the Emperor to surrender Caladan in exchange for the planet Arrakis. On the surface, taking over as hereditary governor of Arrakis sounds like a major triumph. Arrakis is the most important planet in the Empire. It is the source of the spice melange, which is medicinal. It prolongs life. It also is a mutagenic drug that is learned about further into the book and series. In taking over Arrakis, Duke Leto displaces his longtime enemies, the Harkonnens, led by Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. Duke Leto knows this is a trap, and he knows that the Harkonnens will return, more than likely supplemented by the Emperor's own personal troops. In order to defeat this expected invasion, Duke Leto hopes to ally with the Fremen, a people who live on the outskirts of Arakeen society. Unfortunately, before much can come of this proposed alliance, the Harkonnens and the Emperor attack. Duke Leto is killed, and Paul and his mother, Lady Jessica, Bene Gesserit, who has trained Paul, flee into the desert. There they find refuge with the Fremen, and eventually they use a prophecy set by the Bene Gesserit to essentially take over the Fremen and launch a rebellion that with the intent to see themselves restored to power. I have mixed opinions about Dune. I love it. I love the idea of Dune. But actually reading Dune, I'm always unsettled. I don't like Paul Atreides. I don't. Now, I like him in the first part. But as he becomes Paul Muad'Dib, I see him as a fraud. I see him as a monster, a villain. And while I think seeing Paul in that light is what Herbert intends, it feels like the intention isn't enough. That there needs to be some form of a textual sort of furtherance of this criticism. That's never coming. And it bugs me in a way that I don't quite understand if this is actually what Herbert is intending, or if most readers really do see Paul as a legitimate hero, fighting against the vile Harkonnens and the perfidious Emperor. And never really think much about the fact that the entirety of his claim to authority, being the Lisan al-Gaib, the Fremen, is built on a fraud. I mean, we know where this myth came from. We can see it's essentially they are frauds. Even hints that Duke Leto's reputation is in some ways fraudulent. So do most fans of Dune kind of recognize that? And it bugs me to no end. And every time I read Dune, or a few years ago I read all but 2 of the original series, Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, God Emperor of Dune. So the final 2 books that Frank Herbert wrote, I haven't read yet. All of them really sort of bug me in that same way. Except for God Emperor. There's not much you can do to save the monstrosity. That Leto at this point, the God Emperor of Dune, is pretty darn monstrous, but so I'm still struggling with Dune. And hopefully eventually I will kind of figure out what I think about it. But anyway, that was unfortunately my rather disappointing Space Opera September. So for anybody who is interested, whether you're a long-time viewer or if you're new because because you're mostly interested in Space Opera September, I think Wednesday I'm going to do an announcement video for New Worlds November, which is a science fiction reading event on another corner of BookTube, hosted by or created by the Bookish Bryants and hosted by a whole slew of other booktubers, myself included, where we will be reading short works of science fiction in November. And I'll do the announcement video tomorrow. I've already picked the anthology I'm going to be reading, and I just need to debate a few things before I do that video. But anyway, BookTube, thank you. Have a great afternoon. And ooh, one more thing. So I don't know if about tomorrow, because I may have an errand to run tomorrow, but I might also put it off because I have a book coming in, and it's a book I really want, so I'm going to be a bit unmanageable until that book comes in. So I may go ahead and do like a premiere for the T Tag, created by Jim of Jim's Books, Reading and Stuff. So I'll either do as a premiere, or I might just do it at 12:30, depending when I normally film videos. And then on Wednesday again will be my New Worlds November announcement video. So again, thank you, BookTube. Have a great afternoon and stay safe.